Welcome to EQ, What It Is and Why It Matters, sponsored by the ABA Career Center. Moderating the program today is Kathy Morris. Kathy is founder of Under Advisement Limited and former director of career counseling and placement for Northwestern University School of Law, former director of the ABA Career Resource Center and the Center for Continuing Legal Education. She has decades of experience with guiding law students, lawyers, and law firms, focusing on attorney training and professional development. Kathy, you may proceed with the program.
Thanks so much, Bonnie. Welcome, everyone. I think that it's Friday the 13th and a day before Valentine's Day. We thought it was particularly apt to focus on an important topic having to do with the emotions and other aspects of lawyer personality. So we're focusing today, and there's so many of you with us interested in the topic, on emotional intelligence and why it matters particularly to lawyers. And so in that context, we're lucky that we have two faculty people with us today who are particularly versed not only in emotional intelligence but how it relates to lawyers. Ronda Muir is coming to us, by the way, from India today. It's nearly midnight where she is, so we're definitely appreciative. And she's a great example of a lawyer who's worked in traditional roles, and both at law firms. She was with Davis Polk in New York and in-house with the, do we say TAG group, based in Paris, of all places. So that's marvelous. But now she's using her law degree in an alternative capacity, and I know a lot of you like to hear about those things. Ronda is the founder and principal of Law People Management, where she focuses on the application of behavioral science to the legal workplace and to lawyers. And so these are things we really need to know about and are going to be fascinating for us. She came from the University of Texas Law School when she got her JD, and you can read more about her and what Ronda does on her blog, lawpeopleblog.com. I'm also pleased to welcome and introduce, right here from freezing cold Chicago, a University of Denver PhD, Rob Durr. Now, Rob is a staff psychologist at Northwestern University, and interestingly is the primary liaison to Northwestern Law School. And he provides counseling and courses to help law students develop emotional intelligence and many other skills that we need for a successful career in the law. So it's just absolutely fascinating. He also uses his degree in a specialized way. And, of course, both Rob and Ronda have so much to share with us today. So let me thank the Career Center of the ABA for sponsoring the program. And I ask you to take a look at the things that the ABA has to offer, but also we want to focus on the agenda for the slides are just giving me a little bit of fits, but it's cold, so everything's giving me fits. The program agenda, if you haven't been with us before, is that we focus on some top issues and tips. We have a lot of interaction with the audience and between the faculty members. We have an agree-disagree moment, which you'll, I think, like, and some takeaways so that you can definitely think about this further. So without further ado, let me start out by saying that, I think, Rob, you mentioned to me that EQ, emotional intelligence, is also the same as EI. It just is sort of used interchangeably in the literature and whatnot. So that being said, let's start out and just talk with a basic definition of emotional intelligence itself. Rob, how can you kind of capsulize what you would say that is?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to do that. And let me just say first, it's nice to be here. This is a wonderful program and wonderful to speak to everyone today. I hope you're all having a wonderful day wherever you are. Yeah, so emotional intelligence, like a lot of other social psychology constructs, social science constructs, as you might imagine, there are a variety of different definitions. The Encyclopedia of Applied Psychology states that there are really three primary models or definitions of emotional intelligence. We don't have to go into all of those now. There's really kind of five key components that tend to cut across all of these different theories. And let me just walk through those briefly. First, it's the ability to understand and express one's feelings. So really self-awareness and self-expression, just being able to accurately perceive what you're feeling in any given moment. It's also the ability to understand how others feel and to relate with them. So social awareness and empathy are a key part of it. Also the third part is the ability to manage and control emotions. And this is where especially I think the emotion regulation part of it, or what Dan Goleman refers to as self-management, plays out particularly important ways for lawyers. So the ability to regulate your emotions. The fourth area, the ability to manage change and solve problems of a personal and interpersonal nature. So really relationship management and adaptability in the face of change. And then finally, the ability to generate positive mood and stay self-motivated also relates to emotional intelligence.
That's a good capsule. I think the people might ask us, what were those 5 things? So I think what you just said were, in a nutshell, self-awareness, social awareness, self-management, relationship management, and what was the final one?
And some models would include motivation, but that's right, Kathy. Those 4, that's a nice, easy way to say it, that it really has to do with self-awareness, self-management, regulating your own emotions, social awareness, being able to read cues in any given social context on a team or in any relationship, and then being able to manage the emotions involved in relationships. And then finally, that it has to do with generating positive mood and staying motivated in your work.
Right. So, Rhonda, how does that strike you in terms of a beginning point?
Well, what's interesting, I think, is that lawyers, if you look at all the various emotional intelligence assessments, score their lowest in one of the most basic building blocks of emotional intelligence, which is perceiving emotions in themselves and others. Which is a striking difference from other professions.
That's so interesting. I guess we're going to get right into it. Can you, in that may be so, people on the phone with us may be wondering how do they sort of find out how they might rate as to emotional intelligence. Are there some assessments that you can mention quickly in case they wanted to, after they listen to the program and find out more from you to see how they might score or fare?
Sure. I mean, some people, I'm sure, will be able to tell sort of intuitively who in their firm or their business or their department has high emotional intelligence, who doesn't, because there are often people who are good with new recruits or at managing staff or others or with client relationships. But there are, as far as formal assessments, emotional intelligence assessments, there are 3 that Rob and I particularly like. They're included in the resource list for today's program. The first is the Mesquite, M-S-C-E-I-T, which was developed at Yale. Then there's the Baron EQI and EQI2, and then the Daniel Goleman ECI and ESCI. And various schools, business schools, Harvard Business School, et cetera, use these various assessments. But all of these need to be administered by someone licensed and certified to do that.
Okay. I guess that someone asked us if there's a recap of Rob's 4 points, and so I don't know that there is that exactly, but definitely you'll have a resource handout that's going to give you all the information in terms of what else to read, how to follow up, and how to sort of get into these assessments if you're interested. So we kind of anticipated that you might want to. This is somewhat foreign information for lawyers, so we wanted to write that down for you. And we've got some articles also by a lawyer psychologist that Rob works with a lot, Dan DeFoe. So you will see a bunch of good information for you there. So, all right, now in that, the idea being to work with someone who is licensed and certified on EQEI, but also focusing on people who understand lawyers. Rhonda, how does this exactly sort of manifest itself or generally manifest itself? Is there some sort of, I think there was a book you talked to me about which had a story about lawyers.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, that's right, Kathleen. The book I put on the list, which I find interesting, is called Descartes' Error. It's written by a neuroscientist named Antonio Damasio, and it's the true story of his work with a lawyer who had brain surgery for a medical condition, and during the surgery he had lost part of his brain that connected to his emotions. So although all of his other faculties were entirely intact, because the lawyer had lost contact with his emotions, he couldn't make decisions. He had an impaired judgment, no intuition, and he eventually lost his job, his lawyering job, and his family. And what I think is fascinating about this study that puts the issue is that it puts the issue of emotional intelligence in context and identifies the importance of emotional intelligence. So Descartes' error, Descartes said, I think, therefore I am. And what Damasio was saying is that's not enough to make us intelligent. It's important to be able to contact and connect with and express and regulate, etc. All those good words are emotions. That intellect is not enough.
You know, it's interesting listening to the two of you talking about what EI is, how it manifests in lawyers, and how low lawyers sometimes test. We have a question here which I think is kind of fun because it focuses not on oneself but already on someone else's emotional intelligence, which says, and we'll get to the substance, but the question is, what are some useful techniques of dealing with other attorneys who have low EI, like opposing attorneys who are emotionally volatile? But I also want to start first. We'll get to that. But, you know, here, let me start first with people on the phone thinking about themselves. And are you doomed, you know, if you test yourself and you know you have low emotional intelligence intuitively, as Rhonda said? I mean, what then if you find out, you know, indeed you are not high on the scale, though you might have a high IQ? What then, Rob?
Right. Yeah, that's a great question. And as Rhonda was pointing out, I mean, of course, both are essential. And in the legal profession and in professional groups in general, IQ tends to be really high, and emotional intelligence really varies. So we know there's kind of a premium placed on that intellect, and there's low variance there. So emotional intelligence becomes a distinguishing characteristics across the professionals that are out there right now. But no, of course not. No one is doomed, and that's that's the exact point. I have people ask me all the time, can these things really be taught and changed? You know, isn't this just someone's personality and not something that can be changed? Don't you sort of either have the X factor or not? And these skills and competencies that fall under the umbrella of emotional intelligence, again, accurately perceiving your own emotional reactions to colleagues or clients, staying poised under pressure, maintaining your composure, reading social cues, all of these things can absolutely be developed, and that's really what we're doing at Northwestern Law School, and that Rhonda does in her work. And you know, we're all lucky in that people tend to become more emotionally intelligent as they age and mature. Unlike IQ, which really doesn't change significantly over a lifetime, our EQ can evolve and increase with our desire to learn and grow. So yeah, if you're working with someone like Rhonda or I, and upon assessment of your EI, you noticed your overall emotional intelligence was lower, or lower in certain key areas like, say, empathy, then you've accomplished the first key step in that growth and change process, which is just accurate self-awareness and self-assessment, so your ability just to know your own strengths and your own growth areas. So no one is doomed. These skills can be taught, and there is a large and growing body of research that shows they can be developed. There's several wonderful exercises. Some of them we point out at the end in terms of tips that are highly effective interventions to grow in each of these areas of emotional intelligence.
Okay, you know, and the interesting questions are still sort of asking about, you know, others, and when others, you know, are difficult or seem to, like a client who may drop in without an appointment and really wants to be seen right away. And we'll talk about some of those situations. But I think one of the key things here is somebody asked, you know, aren't lawyers supposed to assess situations in a sort of a cold, kind of unemotional, rational, sort of detached, objective fashion? Those are, you know, everything we're told in law school are such critical skills. But sort of how do you, or do you have an example of how having, you know, awareness about emotional intelligence really is important as well in practice, or in balancing your practice with your life? Something a lot of lawyers ask us about. Rhonda, do you have a sort of an example of? We'll try to make this relevant to people.
Sure, Kathy. I mean, I've worked with so many lawyers, and everyone has their own particular challenge or goal. But on that point, there was a lawyer who was trying to balance work with his family. And he was a litigator and get home after a day in court where he had been apt to be angry in the moment or respond poorly under the pressures of work, and found that he was bringing an adversarial, impatient mindset home with him. So he started to work on his emotional self-management, not only in work but also at home. And at home, he decided that when he got out of his car at night, he would look down at a statue in his garden to remind himself that he had left his work and he had left his work emotions at work, and instead he would connect differently and better with his family in an emotional way. And this is just the sort of emotional intelligence skill that we can use to bring awareness, as Rob said, to our particular emotional situation, and then develop cognitive or other cues to help us improve our emotional responses. And he was able to do that with a very simple tool like that.
Yeah, and just to piggyback on that a little bit, if we have time, as I'm listening to that story, which is a wonderful one, I can think of several other examples coming to mind, Kathy, to your question about examples of how this plays out for us, for lawyers, positively and negatively. I think the first example most of us think of is when someone gets upset and angry in the workplace and loses their cool. Then, maybe they say something that later they regret. We've all seen highly intelligent people or a person that we know really fly off the handle and act totally out of character. And that's probably the most common example because they lack the ability to recognize when they're becoming upset, manage that impulse, and then demonstrate emotional regulation. And just real quick to your point about the question that you were getting of, we're taught lawyers are educated to sort of have this cold legal analysis. And what neuroscience has shown us now is that, in fact, there's an emotional mind and an intellectual mind, a rational mind in our brain. And when those two are working in harmony together, we're in a lot better position to respond to difficult situations. We want those working, complementing one another. So we also see emotional intelligence play out significantly in social media a lot. People, just hitting send, again, after kind of just reacting without being aware of what's coming up for them. But I also, just real quick, wanted to mention that the need for EI isn't just a matter of controlling negative emotions. Rhonda gave one good example of something different. We also really see it, for example, in being able to just make small talk with colleagues and clients. I see so much in students and in the lawyers that I work with in the Chicago area who are really interested in just developing basic conversation skills, questions, key questions to ask clients to get to know them. Many of us have really lost the art just to get to know someone. So I can't tell you how important it is to be able to just ask those basic questions of going a little bit deeper, and then listening, basic listening skills, and then share something meaningful. And the skill of being able to tell a client or someone something meaningful, a colleague or a client something meaningful about yourself, which I call a gift because we do that so rarely. So these are all examples of how emotional intelligence plays out in the day-to-day interaction with clients and colleagues, and are really essential in our work.
Someone asked about having more concrete solutions to the different places where EI shows itself, and definitely we're folding that in. But I think someone else has something rather interesting. Is what we're talking about here compartmentalization? Are we talking about control over the different kinds of brain functions and mechanisms of practicing and living? Is it more than that, or is that a good way to think about it?
I don't know, Rob, if you want to answer that, but I think my response is that it's not at all compartmentalization. It's actually the opposite. It's integration of the emotional brain and the cognitive brain. And there's some really good early studies on this where they proved pretty conclusively that the emotional brain is often much more accurate very early on than the cognitive brain. The cognitive brain sort of slowly makes its way to the conclusions that the emotional brain had come up with earlier. And by working the two together, you can be earlier off the block in your intuitions and your decisions, and you'll have the benefit of the emotional data that's there that people who don't have a high emotional intelligence don't have the benefit of. So it's more of an integration. Although I acknowledge for that person who asked that question that control as sort of the factor behind emotional intelligence is one of the criticisms that has been levied against emotional intelligence theories of various sorts more early on, that it was a matter of learning to control your emotions. But it's so much more than that. You can't get to that level until you have all these other components about awareness and that sort of thing.
Right,
yeah,
and that's why.
Can I jump in on that too,
Sure.
Kathy, or do you want to move on?
No, go for it.
I was just going to say I completely agree with Rhonda's response, and obviously part of emotional intelligence is being able to say, oh, I'm feeling this right now, and then maybe the compartmentalization happens when you say, this isn't a good time for that, or you're going to kind of separate out what you're feeling from what you're working on. But what she said about the two minds is what I was saying a second ago, that emotions are there for a reason. And the more we learn about them, the more we understand how they play out significantly in our judgment and problem solving. And I know we're going to come back to that in a minute. But in any given situation, as far as compartmentalization, we have a response, an emotional reaction quicker than we do an intellectual response. In fact, it's really our brain is based on survival and was developed from an evolutionary perspective, in that we have direct channels from the senses to respond in an emotional way. And that's why oftentimes we feel something emotionally before we have rational reason about it. And it's really important for us to be able to recognize what that immediate emotional reaction was and slow down enough to have the intellectual part of it come in.
Right, and I think that some of these questions are sort of trying to get to the solution, like how do you control your anger or other people's anger? But that's why we're doing the program, to understand there's so much more than the sort of black and white tactic kind of thing. It's much deeper, and somebody asked, are people generally good at assessing their own EQ strengths or weaknesses, or is that especially difficult to judge? And I think we're saying that it is hard to judge, but easier if you do some reading about it and listen to what these kind of experts are saying, because it's more significant. There's more to it. As someone asked, we mentioned Daniel Pink's new book, A Whole New Mind.
Yes.
He's, that's a good thing to read too. I think he's a law grad. So I appreciate our audience kind of sticking with us and not trying to, get to solutions too quickly. But here, let me ask you, because, Rob, you mentioned, and we want to get to the things that are practical and what lawyers do, make judgments, problem solve, make decisions. Could you talk, hey, Rhonda, why don't you jump in first, if you don't mind. Could you just talk about sort of that kind of practical value, how EQ, really helps lawyers, not only when somebody's being mean or volatile or angry, but, generally.
Yeah, and one of the more interesting series of studies that have been done is how emotional intelligence helps anyone be better at assessing and predicting outcomes. And I mean things like football games, Academy Awards, even the weather, that higher emotional intelligence people just perform much better at being able to assess all the factors and then predicting outcomes. So you can imagine how important that is in the legal field, being able to take in all the relevant factors and being superior in assessing the situation and predicting an outcome. And I think maybe the best example of how important this can be to a whole profession is how the medical profession has embraced emotional intelligence, and they're well ahead of lawyers with regard to teaching it and practicing it within their field. The faculty and administration in medical schools take EI so seriously because it gives healthcare practitioners better decision-making skills, better diagnoses, and also provides better patient outcomes, just what we as lawyers also would like for our clients. The data shows that those practitioners with higher emotional intelligence take fewer risks, have also fewer malpractice actions against them and therefore have lower liability, all because they have higher emotional intelligence. That's the deciding factor. So in the medical profession, emotional intelligence has become a have-to-have, not a nice-to-have. And there isn't an emotional intelligence conference or training or anything like that on emotional intelligence where I don't see faculty and administrators from medical schools. They are really on top of this.
Yeah, I was just going to say I completely agree. I mean, the medical education and certainly business schools, I'm sure a lot of our audience knows, are really far ahead of legal education, and I think our law schools are catching up. I mean, there's several wonderful faculty out there who are writing and doing work in this area. But yeah, that's a great question, just to come back to answer about how EI plays out in decision making. Ruvan Baron, B-A-R--O-N, one of the three models that Ronda and I have been mentioning that is really a top model of definition of emotional intelligence, he has decision making as a key component of emotional intelligence. And he talks about how problem solving is really the ability to find solutions to problems in situations where emotions are involved. So if you think about any problem solving that you're doing when you're trying to come to a decision, there's a lot of emotional content there. And if we're not acknowledging the process as much as we are just the subject matter or the content in terms of just the decisions or the facts, then we're really leaving out a huge part of rich data in any decision. So we have to be able to understand how emotions impact decision making. Just for example, if you're representing a client in court, you're better off knowing how you feel about that client and what tuning into what your emotional reaction is, so it doesn't negatively impact your performance. So emotions are there for a reason, and as Dan Goleman says, they're really the instant plans for handling life that evolution has instilled in us. So they're a rich source of data that we really want to tune into when we're making a decision or problem solving.
And I think it's important. Not only does you've taught me not only does this EQ affect individuals and how you work, if you're in negotiations or other legal contexts, but in the workplace, it can benefit people bringing out the best in others' work as a supervisor, and all that adds to the workplace dynamics and profitability and whatnot. But let me ask you, because people are saying, and okay, so this is all important. We'll do some reading. How can we improve our EI ourselves, even if it's hard to do? So let's go to your quick tips on the topic, if we can. And I think, Rob, start us off with that about who you might select to work with if you're feeling like you really want to delve into this, but not all on your own.
Right. Well, there's a lot of, it sounds like the audience is really asking a lot of questions about how can I develop these skills. And I think what you're hearing from us first is self-awareness is critical. So one of the first steps is to really ask for feedback from people. Maybe you seek out a way to do an emotional intelligence assessment and get a good sense of what your emotional intelligence is. What are the key areas that are areas of growth for you? And then after you figure that out, all of us can benefit from increasing our emotional intelligence in each of those kind of 4 areas that I was talking about. So, just take the first one, for example, of developing self-awareness, just greater awareness of what you're experiencing in any given moment. A quick tip of something that you can do even after this hour is just to take a little time this afternoon to reflect on a time in the last couple weeks where you had a strong emotional reaction to something. Something really triggered some emotion in you. Write that out. What was it that triggered the emotion? What was the emotional reaction that you had to that particular situation? And how did you react to the situation? What did it evoke in you? See if you can start to identify patterns in your thinking and in your emotions that were triggered by that particular situation. And a lot of times what I talk about is what's referred to as your modus operandi, your MO. A lot of people are familiar with that. Just what's your MO under pressure? So you can, by reflecting on how you tend to respond in any emotionally charged situation, you get a chance to recognize what your MO is under pressure. Another strategy is to use what's called a mantra. And very simply, after we learn our MO, we may identify that we have a hard time staying optimistic, or we have a hard time being empathic, or we have a hard time managing the stress and being good to ourselves. So we may want to develop a short phrase referred to as a mantra, just 2 or 3 words that we can repeat to ourselves that help us regulate our emotions. So if there's somebody that we're working with on a team, for example, and they tend to really irritate us, we may want to have that mantra kind of handy to repeat to ourselves. So those are just a couple tips.
Yeah, people have asked about, is it, kind of similar, their mindfulness and meditation, and that Berkeley is having all program, lots of law schools are. It's different, but it's all of this is designed to help people perform better, help others perform better, avoid the stress, avoid the burnout, avoid the consequences that we see in the profession too often, like substance abuse, and questioners are asking about that, and you're right. That's partly why we want to mention this. But it's interesting, Rhonda, your tip about putting yourself in the shoes of others. Somebody said, well, I find that if I know what buttons to push and I can anger opposing counsel, as opposed to necessarily be empathetic and understand, but anger them, then I can make some points because they're going to be working off their reptilian brain or whatever it would be. So I don't know. Talk to us about putting yourself in the shoes of others and how it might help us construct this concept of
to that comment, let me just say that I would like to make it really clear that in my opinion, being emotional intelligence doesn't mean being nice. In fact, we have some good data that there are really highly emotionally intelligent psychopaths. So there's a big difference between being nice and being emotionally intelligent. But if you are emotionally intelligent, your goals, hopefully, which are good ones, can be accomplished. But exactly the point you make is that emotionally intelligent people understand how others feel. That's the empathy piece. They understand how other people feel under certain circumstances, and then they're able to create circumstances which create those feelings. Now, in negotiations and that sort of thing, emotionally intelligent people tend to be very successful for their clients and also maintain good relationships with their opposing counsel because they're empathic. And so that works to everyone's advantage. But putting yourself in the shoes of others is an easy thing to say, and it can be a very hard thing to do. We were talking about all these different tips. One of the things I think is always helpful is to have someone you think of as an EI buddy, someone you consider to be emotionally intelligent, so you just sort of bounce things off. What do you think he meant by that gesture? How do you think she feels about this process? Just to check your own reactions and see what other reactions might be possible. That can give you a little feedback that's very easy to find in the workplace, assuming you know somebody. Sometimes it's the spouse, sometimes it's not in the workplace, sometimes it's a supervisor, sometimes it's a staff member that you just know has sort of pretty good instincts on this stuff. An EI buddy can help. I mean, you can't really feel how other people feel. You can't do empathy well unless you understand your own feelings. So we keep coming back to self-awareness and self-perception. When you're aware of your emotions, one of the things, the tips I use, like Rob's journal that he was talking about, is Yale uses this exercise to do like a little weather journal. What's your emotional temperature? And to do it 10 times a day, just say, 8, 10, 12, 2, 4, 6, 8, I'm going to write down my emotional temperature, just to bring your awareness of your emotions to your cognitive brain. I'm feeling bored, I'm feeling angry, I'm feeling depressed, and that's not going to get you very far on the surface, but what it's doing is training you to be aware of your emotions. And once you are able to be personally aware of your own emotions, then you're more able to put yourself in the shoes of others. I know how you feel requires feeling on two different sides, both
Right.
yourself and the other person.
Right. It's interesting, the sort of retraining ourselves in a lot of ways from what we were taught is going to win the day, in court or in negotiations or in other ways, and has long-term difficult effects. So we want to we've talked a lot about awareness and strategy. We're going to talk more strategies and skills, but I think people, is this a long-term process? You have a tip, Rhonda, here. Even a little work on EI can make a difference, because it seems, kind of daunting on some levels. So tell us.
Yes, and I think, we have talked about awareness a lot, but as we said, that's sort of a starting point. But there are little things you can do. What your mother said about counting to 10 before you yell at someone, that's still a good idea, because what that does, and if you know this, it'll be helpful to your emotional intelligence growth, is it allows your cognitive and your emotional brain to sort of catch up with each other. Count
Exactly.
to 10 and find out whether or not your cognitive and emotional brain are sort of on the same circuit. Because, this is what we do, right? We fire off that email and then we think, oh, gosh, I wish I hadn't done that. Because you didn't have time to think it through and stuff. It's not that your emotions were wrong. That's important emotional data. But you need to sort of get everybody on the same page, your cognitive brain and your emotional brain. So counting to 10, that's a simple one. I also, as a little simple thing to do to help you, when you're on planes traveling around, put the movie on mute and see if you can read the storyline by reading the emotional cues that are going on in the movie. Some people do this very easily. For others, it's hard, but it's something you can practice. You just do with TV, too. You turn it on mute. Don't hear the spoken words. See the emotional expressions and see if you can follow it.
Yeah, if I can I piggyback on that for a second,
Sure.
Kathy, and just respond to that too while we're on the tips, if that's okay? I
Yeah.
love what Rhonda's saying about that these things, though some of the deeper thinking, feeling, coping, relating patterns are the result of a long period in our life, and some of those do take time to understand where they come from and then make significant changes. That work can take some time, of course, but these are simple tips and exercises that any of us can do that show, research shows results happen pretty quickly. And I wanted to respond just a couple things. One is about having a difficult colleague. Somebody had asked, I know we got some questions about how do you respond to a difficult colleague. We're so quick to react to our colleagues and to our clients and have a quick reaction. And if we can validate and try to practice empathy for the people that are in our lives, it's amazing how that approach can have huge impact as opposed to being adversarial. So oftentimes we react really quickly and just are reactive to colleagues that we struggle with. And if we can take a step back and try to understand what they're feeling and what they're going through, and that's the core of empathy. And that relates to the tips that I wanted to say. There's really two big things that I see lawyers struggling with. One is isolation. So many lawyers feel really lonely or isolated in their work. And psychologists can relate to this because a lot of times we're on our own writing or reviewing things or working with one client. And what I would recommend for that, and you mentioned mindfulness earlier, and mindfulness is a key area of growth in the legal community that really helps with emotional intelligence. But what you can start to do is to practice empathy, start to raise your empathy to help with building community and overcoming the isolation and loneliness that's out there. When we're empathic, we're more compassionate, and community starts to follow. We're able to find people like us. And there's a really simple, I think empathy goes back to mental habits. And there's two mental habits that are really critical. So if you think to yourself, yeah, I get it, empathy matters. They keep saying this over and over, but how do I develop my empathy? The first one is just the habit of human similarity, and this is not my original work. This is actually from an engineer at Google who wrote an excellent book called Search Inside Yourself. But what he says is that there's two mental habits. The first one is anytime you walk into a room, we're so quick to just judge people and look for differences. And if we can change that and start to look for similarities by practicing the mental habit, you are just like me. You're just like me. So when that difficult colleague comes around and you look at them and you say, what are our similarities as opposed to differences, that's going to start to increase your perceived similarity. The more we perceive someone to be just like us, the more we can empathize with them. So the second empathy mental habit is kindness. And this has been talked about a lot, that if we offer kindness, kindness motivates you to care, and it makes you more receptive to others. So if we offer kindness to those around us, even the difficult colleagues and clients that we work with, and it's again based on mental habits, if we repeat the thought, I want this person to be happy, I want this person to be happy, then our empathy is going to go up for them. So those are a couple simple mental habit tips that I think are critical for developing empathy, which can help build community and help you from being isolated. The second thing is that lawyers really struggle with is staying optimistic, and that's a core part of emotional intelligence because we have to be able to manage our mood and being able to regulate our mood. And you all are in a very difficult field that you're doing incredibly demanding work, and it's really easy to start to get pessimistic and think negatively. So one of the simple strategies for developing optimism comes from Martin Seligman and his work at the University of Pennsylvania on positive psychology, and it's called the 3 good things habit. For any of you who've heard me talk before, I always teach this technique because it's so simple and so wonderful, and all you do is at the end of every day for the next week or couple weeks, write down 3 things that went well today and why they went well. 3 things that went well today and why they went well. Research shows that if you practice that, that's practicing optimism, your brain will actually make the changes where you will actually become more optimistic in your life.
Because one of our listeners asked about, well, what about our own self-doubt or being overly critical of ourselves? Lawyers do that quite a lot, and I think that exercise, is a really good one to help people look at how you do sort of change the needle. Quickly agree-disagree moments, and I want to ask Rob if, some people think EI is pop psychology, it's just a fad, this isn't the stuff that's really going to help us. Agree, disagree? I think I know what you're going to say, but I think
you probably know what I'm going to say. But I also, and one of the reasons I like presenting with Ronda is I think we both agree we really get that, and even being a psychologist who I think we're doing emotional intelligence in therapy all the time. I'm aware that it's really a new concept, and it's easy to think to see it as a fad. And I can just say that there is a large and growing body of research around. I think you pointed out it's like over 40,000 studies have been done in this area, and so that's good. To have that validation. I'm all for empirical support of this being a real thing. But I think what's even more important is that we all know what we're talking about. Like Rhonda said earlier, most of us have a pretty good intuition, a good sense of who's emotionally intelligent and who's not. We most likely go to them. They're a little warmer. They're a little easier to relate to. They retain clients. They move up the ladder because they're able to read dynamics in any given situation. They can understand the emotional content that's there. So, these areas, these competencies and skills have a real hard value in the workplace.
And I want to do an agree-disagree with Rhonda, but let me mention that the one audience person said, can you tell us about how emotional intelligence led to a better decision for an attorney at work? And I think we've all seen those lawyers that kind of want to send people away. Like if you're disruptive, your people don't want to work with you. Sometimes the lawyer's reaction is, well, we got to let this person go. And some of what we're saying today is, the emotional intelligence to understand and help that person get at what is making them difficult or, so to speak, disruptive, how they can be better empathetic. That's going to make a difference for the culture and for the whole of, our collective workplaces. So these things have real practical applications broadly and individually. But somebody did ask, and let me ask you, Rhonda, because do you agree or disagree that an audience member said, well, EI seems to be the same thing as active listening. Do you agree?
No, I disagree. Active listening is certainly an important skill, but active listening is a matter of being attentive to and understanding and etc. what is being said. And emotional intelligence is often about what is not being said, what people mean or what they're disclosing with their emotions, but that is unarticulated. So active listening is a very powerful tool in in understanding other people, but it's not the same thing as reading emotional cues and understanding what those emotional cues mean and how to approach a person with those particular emotional cues.
Mhm. Mhm. You mentioned, I think, the idea of what's unstated, and one of our audience people asked if, based on your tip about listening to a movie with the sound off, and this person asks, well, isn't it also important how people say what they say, in the sense that what if you listen to a movie that's in another language, one you don't understand, but you don't read the subtitles? Should you be able to gather information from tone of voice and visual cues? And is that part of, sort of the same question here, Rhonda?
Yes. I mean, yes, the short answer is yes, that you could do it that way. You're getting a little more data because you're getting, like you said, tone and that sort of thing. There was an interesting study done with doctors where they took a 30-second clip of them talking to a patient, and they obliterated the words. All you could hear was sort of the tone, the rise and fall of the voice. And using that 30-second clip, they were able to identify with 85% accuracy the doctors who were sued for malpractice, which shows you that just the tone gave away emotional cues. And the emotion that they identified, that people heard in the tone, was one of arrogance, dominance, and which leads you to the conclusion, which is true both of lawyers and doctors, that people sue people they perceive to be arrogant.
Okay, so now someone has asked us the question that, sort of we started with, which gets at other people. How do you deal with a low EI lawyer? If you think you have better emotional intelligence and it serves you somewhat well, but you're dealing with someone across the table, or a colleague who has a lot of business but doesn't seem to be very adaptable or generating positive mood, how do you deal with it? What do you do? We're talking about how we improve our own, but I mean, what do we do? Is that answerable by either?
Of course.
Yeah,
it's
Rob,
absolutely
do you want to
answerable. I'd love to just take a first shot at it. I think I was answering it a little bit already, but hopefully it's come clear or come through that empathy is crucial in this, in being able to, and again, self-awareness is as well, because whoever's asking it, maybe you have somebody that you're thinking of. I would encourage you to practice stepping back and thinking about what is your reaction to that person. Let's start there, first, because I know you're saying it's about this other person, how do I deal with them? And I would say it begins, again, with self-awareness, understanding what are they evoking in you? What is it that they're bringing out in you? And then here's where the empathy comes in, the social awareness part of it. What are they feeling? What's coming up for them? And then after you have a good sense of that, I think your empathy is going to go up for them a little bit, and that's going to pull out the defensiveness a little bit. Another tip that I would recommend is to start thinking about why you need to do something at all. I mean, if you're wanting to have a conversation with them, reflect on why it is that you want to raise an issue. So if you're wanting to raise the issue with someone, ask yourself, what do you hope to accomplish by raising this issue? If it's somebody that you work closely with and you feel like you have to say something to them about this, it's going to be really important for you to start from kind of an objective, third story, really trying to see things from a factual or an objective place first. So I think those are all really important strategies, to look within first, to understand what they're evoking in you, try to have a sense of what they're going through, really be able to relate to what's coming up for them, and then to think about what it is that's motivating you to want to say something to them.
We had an interesting question here that asks, is there a line to be crossed where a sense of EI is seen as, or actually is, a character weakness? Now, I'm not sure.
Yes,
okay.
There is.
Tell us about that.
Good question. There is. There's been very few studies that looked at what are the downsides of having high emotional intelligence. What is the weakness part of it? And these are the two that are interesting. There's not a lot of research in this area, but there's a little bit. And the 2 points are, one, that people might it might be harder for some leaders to make the hard decisions that actually, fire a bunch of people, close down that they might be so empathic that they're not able to do what's sort of best for the company. That there's a risk of that. It's not, it's not likely, but there's a risk of that. There's also some funny research that says there's sort of a downside from high emotional intelligence because people they don't spot liars as easily. And I've always found that interesting. I think that's because, again, from the empathy standpoint, you're trying to believe and be in the place of that person. So there is a little downside to high EI, and there's probably some other oddball research out there that may or may not be true. But you can see that if you're so empathic that you can't make hard decisions that might, in fact, deprive somebody of their livelihood, or et cetera, then it can be a negative in the workplace.
Interesting. I mean, are there any sort of studies having to do with gender, how gender impacts the EI sort of abilities, or someone asked about culture?
Yes. Well, on gender, if you ask 100 people in the street, they'll usually say women have higher emotional intelligence. And there is some backup for that, but it's not at all definitive. It's more that there are, again, on the empathy side, women often have a little higher empathy, but then men have, we're talking very broadly, obviously, the whole gender, but men have also a strength often in regulating their emotions. The problem there is that men can sometimes slip over into suppression of emotions, which is not a healthy regulation if you just suppress them. Or as one of the questioners asked about controlling them. There has to be sort of a healthy regulation of the emotions. But men seem to be a little better at regulating, and women seem to be a little better at empathy. But if you look at the overall scores on, the accepted emotional intelligence test, they're about the same. And culturally, that's also interesting. But what we have, and we have assessments from all over, including from here in India. There was just 2 weeks ago a major international conference on emotional intelligence in India. And the cultures seem to be pretty similar, the scores, culture to culture.
Okay.
Yeah, I would just say too, like in terms of maintaining interpersonal relationships, that there was a study done in the 90s by Weissman, who found that I think it was like about 40% of female attorneys placed a high value on maintaining interpersonal relationships, and only like 17% of male attorneys did. So I think there's difference in the value that's placed on it as well. And like Rhonda was pointing out, in terms of gender differences, overall findings are mixed as to whether men and women tend to differ in their degree of emotional intelligence, although there is research from 2008 or 9 that showed that generally women tend to score higher on empathy than men. So definitely a fascinating area.
And a lot of interesting cross-cultural EI issues, too, that someone has brought up and mentioned. And I think we'll get at some of that, too, when we get to your takeaways, which I think we can turn to now, because I think there's some more information in here touching on a lot of these questions. So I think a couple first from Rhonda. I think your first takeaway is avoid thinking of emotional intelligence as a soft skill.
Right, because what is soft? Yes, it might make, hopefully will make interactions in your workplace more collegial, more tolerable in some cases. So it has that sort of warm glow about it. But emotional intelligence has very hard bottom line results. We have overwhelming amount of data in most every other profession, so since there's very little research on lawyers, it must apply to lawyers too, that absolute profitability, bottom line, net income, net revenue improves if you have an emotionally intelligent leadership, if you have an emotionally intelligent work crew, and then the higher you are in those cases, the more profitable the company or the law firm is. I mean, there's some very direct data showing that emotional intelligence has a major impact on profitability, on liability, on malpractice claims, for example, medical costs for law firms, law departments, businesses, because emotionally intelligent people are generally in better health, manage their stress better, aren't likely to keel over from a heart attack in the workplace. So those sorts of things have real hard impact on revenues and on profitability. So yes, there's the warm fuzzy side to it, but do not think of it as sort of a soft skill. It's something that makes your lawyering better, makes your firm or your department or your business healthier. It has some very clear, hard results.
And if your next tip about reading more about it, I want to hear what you have to say about that too, in addition to the resource materials. But even reading more about it, can you just, somebody just asked, again, what is the Q and EQ and why isn't it just EI? Can you read things about that if you have these questions that you want to follow up with? Where might you look to find some of the information and research you've talked about today?
Well, I think the Consortium for Research on Emotional Intelligence in Organizations, which is a website which is listed in the materials, it has a really good overall view of the major research, and it can talk to you about EQ and EI. EQ just means emotional quotient, and EI means emotional intelligence, and sometimes it was made in juxtaposition with the IQ, intellectual quotient, intelligence quotient, so that they used EQ to distinguish it, but on a similar bell curve from IQ. So they're used interchangeably, EI and EQ. But the Consortium for Research on Emotional Intelligence in Organizations, which is a website that's easily accessible and has loads of information. And I'm also working on a book on emotional intelligence for lawyers, which the ABA will be publishing, hopefully, by around the end of the year. So I hope to have a lot of information, some things we've talked about and more in that book.
Excellent, excellent. Okay, Rob, let's get with your next tip into another sort of activity people could do. You say do activities to sharpen your focus on EI, and you've given us some. What's another one that you can leave as a takeaway?
Yeah, well, I think just continuing to be in touch with what your reaction is to this area, like what your beliefs or your initial thoughts are about emotional intelligence. Those can play out for you really significantly. So if you have a strong reaction, be tuned into that. But the bullet point that's on your screen there, do activities to sharpen your focus on EI, is just thinking more about how can you really wrap your mind around what this is and how it's playing out for you. I mentioned an exercise earlier of thinking back over the last couple weeks about emotionally jarring situations you found yourself in and how you reacted, and that's a wonderful way to do it. Another thing you can do is what's called the best boss or best teacher exercise. That's really common in emotional intelligence and leadership development trainings, and that's just to have you think about who was your best boss. As you reflect back over your life, think about who was the best mentor or boss that you had, and what were some of the qualities and tendencies that you notice in them. That can be a way to really highlight what emotional intelligence is, because oftentimes those qualities fall under this umbrella. And then the last point there of just be patient as you put EI to work is to try these things and try out asking for feedback. We've mentioned, Rhonda and I have mentioned a lot of tips and a lot of exercises over the last hour. And I'm also happy to follow up. I'm available, easily found on the Northwestern website. Feel free to email me with questions, and I'm happy to follow up. But just to be patient and to kind of that self-awareness, self-assessment process can take time. So be patient as you put that into work.
Mm-hmm. And I think we do see some progress and some changes and more interest in this topic. So it's great that you're both prominent experts and available, and Rhonda, you blog, and so that I think is very helpful. And I would say that as people think also about, and I think Rob mentioned this to me once, who's a shining star at work? Who are the people that really succeed? How do we sort of look at what is effective, even though, yes, there are bullies, and yes, sometimes people, there are people with lots of business who have very low EQ, and and they're considered valuable, but that's not the norm, and that's not the way we want to model ourselves. And you can be successful, we're being told by these experts in the literature, you can be more successful if you discard some of the old things we had thought about, made for lawyer success, and think in new ways. So we hope that has really helped you focus on this topic. Of course, we have other upcoming programs. So the page I want you to go to, and also materials from this and other programs, is www.ambar.org/advice. And this program and others are archived, and so is the material. And we want to encourage you to come back and be with us next month. I think there are two kinds of lawyers: those who have just had a job loss, and those who are kind of concerned they may have a job loss. And so we're going to focus on moving forward after a job loss in March. And you can go to the page and sign up even now. So thank you so much to Rob and to Rhonda and all the listeners. We are going to have this evaluation on the line. We'd like you to fill it out and help us. And on behalf of the ABA and the Career Resource Center, we bid you thank you.